There are three kinds of kindred spirits, if you will: giving, forgiving, and thanksgiving. Usually where you find one, you can find them all. So, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about forgiveness tonight, what it is, what it really is, and how we get it, and how we give it. But let's talk about forgiveness first. Before we define what it is, let's talk about what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not just ignoring those who wrong us. Forgiveness is more than just a refusal to strike back at somebody, the whole tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye we're so used to. You see, you might refrain from doing those things, but if you still harbor bitterness and ill will, you really haven't forgiven anybody. Forgiveness is not ignoring sin. Forgiveness is not putting the offender on some sort of probation while we discuss his inexcusable behavior and then promising we'll forgive him as long as there's no more future events that may offend us. What we can tell what forgiveness is by observing how God forgives us. He removes the notion from the record in Acts. Hebrews tells us he forgets it, putting it out of his memory. And probably the hardest one for us to fully grasp and the hardest one for us to fully emulate is that he treats us like he did before we had sinned against him, receiving us back wholeheartedly. I like forgiveness. Most of us probably do. I like it when my wife forgives me for when I'm rude or when I've been unkind. I like it when my son forgives me for when I am impatient with him. I like others that forgive me when I need it, when I've done some wrong to them or where I feel I deserve it. But I especially like God's forgiveness. As believers, we revel in the fact that God does not hold sin against us. He removes our sin, and as the psalmist says, as far as the east is from the west. I like forgiveness a lot, and I'm sure you do too. And we like that part of it. But there's a part of forgiveness that's not so easy to enjoy. You see, Jesus mentions at the end of his model prayer, "And forgive us of our debts as we have forgiven our debtors," in Matthew chapter 6. Verse 12. And to make sure we didn't miss that little point, he kind of puts a postscript on the end of it. He says, "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others of their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive yours." That's in Matthew 6, 14 through 15. Forgive us of our debts. We like that part. As we have forgiven others. Yeah, we don't like that one so much. I'm not sure why it's so hard to forgive others. It might be because we like holding on to that little bit of power that it gives us over somebody else. That we can tell them later on, "Remember when you did something against me," or "Remember when you did this." It gives us that little bit of power to hang on to. Or maybe it's we think that they don't really deserve it. Maybe we think that, well, they're just going to keep doing this over and over again, so they don't really deserve our forgiveness. We see Jesus calls us to a higher road. He asks us to forgive as we've been forgiven, which means that we can't forgive those who deserve it, or just those who we think deserve it, because after all, do we really deserve God's forgiveness? It means we can't be concerned about them getting properly punished because we don't get the punishment we deserve. And it means we can't hold a grudge over their heads because when God forgives us, he never brings it up again. Are you holding something against your spouse? Are you nursing a grudge against a friend? Do you have something against one of your brethren here at church? Is your relationship with one of your kids strained because of a grudge? Relationships are always complicated, and there's no easy answer. But the first step you might take is to forgive. Let the past go. Drop the grudge. It's not going to be the easiest part of your walk with Christ, but it's a crucial part of your walk with Christ. Have you ever wanted somebody else to forgive you for something you did? I'm sure we all have. The question is, why do you want them to forgive you? Is it so you could get forgiveness, so you could rebuild a relationship, get a new start, restore love and trust? When we seek forgiveness from a person, we want the opportunity to change our lives and put our past mistakes behind us. Or is it because we simply got caught and we're trying to exploit someone else's love by using their forgiveness to create some sort of a selfish opportunity to do as we please? You see, most people that are that way, they're not really sorry for what they did. They're just sorry they got caught, and they want forgiveness for really getting caught, but they want to keep doing what they're doing. So do we want and seek God's forgiveness? Of course we do. Do we sincerely want an opportunity to redirect our lives? Or do we try to exploit God's love by using his forgiveness to continue in sin? Well, if you've ever read through Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, you know that's not how it works. Some translations say, God forbid. Some say, may it never be. For the Christian who makes a serious commitment to live in God's light, to honestly live for God, God's goodness expressed in forgiveness is given without measure. It cannot be exhausted. So we cannot limit how much we forgive, because God doesn't limit how much he forgives. We are continually forgiven of our trespasses to God and the sin that we commit, so we should do the same to forgive those around us. John, in 1 John, urges the serious Christian to understand just how perfect and complete God's forgiveness really is. You see, when a committed Christian who seeks to live for God does something wrong, we have an advocate with the Father. And this advocate does two things for us. It represents Christians seeking God's mercy, and the advocate also asks God to accept his pure sacrifice, his pure blood, to satisfy divine judgment, divine anger, and divine wrath. And in nowhere, when you read the Bible, when it talks about God forgiving us, does God expect us to be absolutely perfect? But yet, we seem to forgive others only on the guarantee that they're never going to sin against us again. Is that what God wants for us? Is that how we're supposed to live our lives? You've heard it said, and you might have said it yourself, I just cannot forgive that person. Well, God does not require the impossible. What you're really saying is, I will not forgive that person, or I refuse to forgive that person. Joseph forgave his brothers for selling him into slavery. Stephen forgave those who were stoning him at the moment he was being stoned. Jesus forgave us all, forgave me at the moment of his death, and still does. It is a Christian who forgives like God forgives. It is a Christian who loves like God loves that exists each and every day in the light. But the Christian who refuses to forgive lives in darkness and is blinded by what he cannot see going on around him. When God's forgiveness is coupled with our commitment to him, both are bound together with the love that lives in us because we belong to Christ. We experience ideal spiritual relationship. Our commitment will not exploit the forgiveness of God. The forgiveness extended by God's goodness will never be exhausted. And in that security, it is our faith in and commitment to God that allows us to be preserved and protected by his power. It's in 1 Peter. If you'll turn over to Matthew chapter 18, verses 21. It's the story of the unmerciful servant, a parable of the unmerciful servant. Now, whenever Jesus answers a question with a parable, it kind of gives me the impression that he's like, you know, you really ought to know this answer already, Peter, but I'm going to tell you maybe in a way you'll easier understand. You see, Peter asked about the limits of forgiveness. 7 times was Peter's answer. So you got to kind of wonder if maybe Peter was keeping score. He had like a little tally book behind him, and he's like, okay, John's got 1, Timothy's got 2, Judas, he's up at 5, you know, keeping track of all these offenses that he thought was offensive. But Jesus is going to show in this parable that under God's grace, it's really hard for a disciple, a true disciple, not to show mercy. The structure of the parable is pretty simple. You see, a man who served the kingdom incurred an outrageous debt. We're talking 10,000 talents. Now, a talent, from what I've been told in the research I did, is a measure of mass. Now, when used with money, it's either like gold or silver. Some translations say he owed 10,000 talents of gold. Some don't really specify. So we really don't know what the actual metal was or the talent was. And we don't know what the exchange rate was. But we know that it was a great sum of money. More than he could repay in his lifetime, apparently. Because his real 2 options, when he goes into the king, he's faced with one of 2 things: slavery for him and his whole family for life, or perhaps, if he's lucky, just prison for him. But the king responds with mercy. And that's the key virtue of this whole parable, is mercy. It's the whole theme of Matthew 18. The man's debt is forgiven, and it's a debt he could never pay. And it's not like the king said, hey, don't worry about it, you can pay me later. We'll make some payment options for you, you know. No, it wasn't that. It was, your debt's gone. You owe nothing. Now, how many of us would like the bank to come up to you and say, hey, you know, the house mortgage you got, those car loans you got, student loans you got, it's all gone. You owe nothing to nobody for anything. How would it make you feel? Make me feel pretty good. So, what's the man do? He goes out, finds somebody owes him 100 denarii, or denarii. And 100 denarii, a denarius is a Roman coin. And it was printed in about the 3rd century BC, and it was about the standard. Somebody said that 100 denarii was a day's wage. So think of minimum wage. So here we have a guy who's got 10,000 talents that he owes the king, and he's all forgiven. And he goes out and finds a guy who owes him 100 denarii. Now, somebody said that it's like 6,000 denarii to 1 talent. So that gives you an idea of the ratio of what he owed versus what he was due. And what's he do? He throws the guy in prison. 100 denarii could have been easily paid out. Like I said, it's a day's wage. If you owed somebody a day's wage and they were willing to work with you, you could say, okay, I'll pay you 1/5 today and 1/5 tomorrow, and 5 days you have it paid off. But he was unwilling to even do that. I mean, that'd be like one of us. The bank tells you you're all scot-free, and you go to somebody and say, hey, you owe me $50. If you don't pay me, I'm taking you to jail. We'd think that person's pretty ungrateful. So, the king finds out, as all kings do. The man's lack of mercy shames the king, because he gave this great mercy to this man, and then he went out and just abused it. He doesn't reflect the magnitude of the grace he received. So how can we limit forgiveness and mercy when we are made aware of how much God has forgiven us and how much merciful he has been towards us? The parable pushes us to take seriously the outline behaviors explained in the text. Our goal should be reconciliation. The very least this man should have done was, hey, you owe me this money, don't worry about it. I just got off 10,000 talents. You're good with 100 denarii. But he didn't. He forgot what God had done for him, or what the king had done for him. In 1967, James Robert Ringrose had been on the FBI's most wanted list. See, he was a forger, writing bad checks. Now, if you're under the age of about 40, maybe 50, you have no idea about writing checks. Some of us in our younger years, you'd think, okay, I get paid on Friday, I'm gonna write this check on Wednesday, it should float a couple of days, because there was no electronic banking. This is not what this man did. He wrote millions of dollars in checks, would cash them, and then leave the country, leave the area. Had no intention of paying them. Well, he gets caught and he's in Japan, and he spends some time in Japanese jail. And then when he's returned to the U.S., he meets with the FBI because he's still a wanted man. And the agents who are transporting him back to justice, he told them he's got something for him. He's got an item he's been saving for just this occasion. And believe it or not, he presented the FBI with a monopoly get-out-of-jail-free card. He thought that that's all he needed to do. Well, we know that justice doesn't get served that way. He thought it was that simple. When a crime is committed, one has to pay. Somebody pays. Now, of course, you can get pardoned from your crimes. Most of us heard familiar illustration preached in a lot of sermons about somebody who's on death row. And at the last minute, the governor comes in and pardons them. And all the guy has to do is get up and walk out. And we like to use that illustration to show that God has pardoned us, and all we have to do is get up and walk out. Well, is it truly that simple? In the sense that God forgives us because of his mercy and grace, and not because we merit it or deserve it, then it is that simple. But in the sense that God's forgiveness is some sort of a legal transaction like a pardon or a get-out-of-jail-free card, then no, it's not. Forgiveness isn't simple at all, and you and I know there's much more to God's forgiveness. The case of the prisoner pardoned by the governor, such an act may be legally binding and very effective for what they do in the legal system, but the governor isn't really forgiving anything. The governors and presidents have pardoned people they've never met, that they don't know. The pardon is not personal. The prisoner or accused has not personally offended or harmed the governor. The pardon isn't even delivered in person. It's sent through the courts and through the jail system and the prison system, and eventually gets down to the warden. When the pardoner gives a death row inmate, does he come calling on that prisoner and say, hey, come over to my house and have dinner? Does that mean that prisoner can now come to the governor's house and be best friends? We know it doesn't happen that way. The governor isn't truly forgiving this man. He just offered him a pardon. That's why you and I know there's much more going on in true forgiveness. Jesus tells a story that describes what it truly means to forgive and to truly be forgiven. Luke chapter 15, story about a man who has two sons. The younger son was very disrespectful to his father. He was greedy and dishonorable. He goes up to his father and says, look, Dad, I want nothing to do with your business. I want nothing to do with this farm, this ranch. I want my half of the money now. I don't want to wait till you die. I want it all right now. Now, I read an article about this, and they said that under the law at the time, the father had every right to have the son dragged out, beaten, and become a slave for being so disrespectful to him. The father chose not to do that. The father chose, okay, I'll give you what you want. And he gave it to him. We know what happened. This dishonorable and greedy child leaves his father, goes to a faraway land. Now, you ever wonder why it was a faraway land, why he didn't stay local? If I were to guess, I'd say it's because the local people knew him. The local people knew his father. He wanted to get away from everybody he knew so he could live his life the way he wanted to live it without any repercussions at all, without anybody telling him that that's not the right thing to do. So he went off. And that's exactly what he did. The Bible says, in some translations, riotous living. He went out and just wasted all that money, bought lots of friends, lots of parties, lots of food. And when all the money ran out, the friends ran out. His house got repoed, his car got repoed. He had to get a job. And it wasn't a good job either. See, he had to go work for somebody else's pig farm, throwing slop to the pigs. And for a Jew, that was very degrading. Only slaves did that kind of work. And it says, the Bible tells us that he longed for the slop he was giving the pigs. One day, he realizes, I have sinned against my Father. My Father's servants are treated better than I am right now. I will go home to my Father, beg his forgiveness, and ask him to treat me like a servant. Because you see, the servants are being treated better. So, he heads home. Now, the father of this foolish child sees him approaching the house. And again, by all rights under law, the father could have had him imprisoned, beaten, treated as a slave. Some of us might have thought, well, we're going to teach him a lesson. We'll let you come back, but we're going to make you a servant for 6 months, and you're going to work your way up, and you're going to pay off all that debt that you owe to teach you a lesson. That's not what the father did. Truly unconventional, he throws decorum completely out the window, and he runs to his son, something that important people didn't do. They didn't run. He lavishes love on his son who has hurt his family so horribly. It is so overwhelming display of forgiveness, it borders on almost shameful. The man had 2 sons, and the oldest one was completely dumbfounded. He puts the ring on, he puts a brand new coat, puts new shoes on. They start a big feast. True forgiveness. We don't have a lot about the rest of the story, if you will, but you got to wonder if that son, what that weight of that cloak felt like, knowing that he'd been truly forgiven. Was the ring on his finger just a little bit loose because he'd been eating pig slop? Did he feel it? Did he rub his cheek where the father had kissed him? Something he hadn't done in months or years, however long he'd been gone. Did he feel the sandals beneath his feet and think, man, I am truly home? Sadly, the older brother was willing to forfeit fellowship with the father because he was unwilling to forgive his brother. Forgiveness is not as simple as a pardon or a reprieve. Forgiveness seeks to reconcile the relationship between offenders and offended. Forgiveness strives for love and for fellowship. The son confessed his sins, and he named himself a slave. The father acknowledged that his son was sinning, forgave him, and called him his son. It's true forgiveness, true love. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness is costly sometimes. There's a good amount of time and effort goes into the business of restoring relationships. That's true of you and I whenever we forgive and reconcile. It is all the more true of our God who forgives us. He doesn't simply announce a pardon or call a truce. God works through the cross in our lives, and he works to overcome the very human resistance that we have towards forgiveness. Accepting forgiveness can make us anxious. Sometimes we'd rather deal with comforting control of the law or the neat simplicity of a get-out-of-jail-free card, because forgiveness is costly. But God is forgiving us. He is truly forgiving us. So, how can we tell if we've really forgiven somebody else based on what we know of God's forgiving of us? Well, do I secretly rejoice when the offender, someone who's offended me, falls into some sort of Oh, I don't know, misfortune? Do I kind of like smile? Yeah, he deserved that. Well, if you do, have you really forgiven him? Do I speak to them hesitantly or abruptly and only under duress? Do I vividly remember the wrong committed? Do I ever sit in silence and mediate and brood over what was done to me by somebody else? If particular circumstances arose and if it's a brother that offends you, if he came down forward asking for prayers, would you happily and anxiously go to God in their behalf? Or are you thinking to yourself, he'll just do it again? Have you truly forgiven him? Forgiveness is reconciliation. Remember, psychiatrists and really smart people have said for years that when you harbor hatred, ill will, and bitterness, it only burns you up. Half the time, the people that you're bitter towards don't even know it. And all of your anger is towards you. Bastel Barrett Baxter tells the story of riding in an airplane, and he sits down next to a blind man who's a business executive. Brother Baxter, out of his curiosity, says, were you born blind or did something happen? And the man confesses to him that it was one of his competitors hired a gang and they poured acid on him and it blinded him. And the man says, well, did you know who it was? He said, yeah, I absolutely knew who it was, but I could never prove it in court. Well, Mr. Baxter asked if he ever felt resentment of it. He said, oh, for a long time I felt a lot of resentment. And then I realized I was only doing myself more injury. So I forgave the man. And actually, years later, I was able to help him out of some problems that he was in. That's true forgiveness. You will find it easier to forgive when you consider how greatly you have been forgiven. Remember the story of the unmerciful servant. The man went out from the presence of the king. When we get away from God, we sometimes forget what he has done for us. Because we go out of the presence, we forget the mercy extended to us. And so then we're guilty, or could be guilty, of acting the same way the unmerciful servant was, because we forgot how God has forgiven us. We need to ask God for help in your prayers. But if you really want to be a forgiving person, there's a difference in just saying a prayer and praying. You've got to really want it. Practice praying for your offender. That's not an easy thing to do. Somebody who offends me, I'm supposed to pray for them? Yes. Be specific. Say their name. Jesus prayed often for the people that offended him, people that crucified him. He didn't say, hey, make sure these people get their just rewards. He said, forgive them. Forgiveness has to do with feeling, and through meaningful prayer on behalf of the offender, we can come to create love and feeling. It's hard to hate somebody you're praying for every day. It's hard to be resentful to somebody who you're praying for every day. Whenever you speak to other people about this individual, speak kindly. Don't speak any ill words. Try to develop an understanding heart. The circumstances, you run into somebody and you have this blowout offense one way or the other, you don't know what caused that person to be so irritable in the first place. Something might have happened just before you got there and he just happened to take it out on you. Try to develop an understanding heart. Cultivate the grace of mercifulness and compassion. So just how am I to forgive? From the heart. You cannot forgive by lip service alone. It has to come from the heart. If you continue to harbor malice and ill will, you can say, I forgive you all you want, and it really isn't. We have to forgive as God forgives. If you look at Matthew chapter 18, Ephesians 4, Colossians 3, the even as means in the same manner. So we are to forgive in the same manner that God forgives us. God forgives freely. God forgives abundantly. God forgives immediately. God forgives finality, and he gives uncalculatory. He doesn't remember it. He doesn't keep track. He doesn't keep notes. So, how often do we have to forgive? We talked about Peter earlier. Peter said, I think 7 is enough. Jesus said, did not say unto thee 7 times, but 70 times 7. He wasn't talking a mathematical figure here. Jesus is trying to teach Peter that forgiveness is about quality, not quantity. He's saying, don't keep a ledger for forgiveness. It's not a matter of mathematics or bookkeeping, but of love. And love has no limits. Let us avoid saying, it'll do him no good to forgive him. He's just going to do it again. Let's try to look at it and say, I really pray for forgiveness of this guy, and I really want to help this guy get through this. As long and as frequently as somebody says, I repent, we're supposed to forgive them. Now, $64,000 question for those of you that remember. Who must take the initiative when it comes to forgiving? The offender or the offendee? Well, Matthew 5 tells us it's the offender. Yes, before the offender can worship scripturally, he must first straighten things out with the offended one. What's it say? If you have something against a brother, you go to that brother. So the closest way to God may be to your brother's house. You go to that brother and you try to rectify. If that doesn't work, you take a couple people with you. Then you take the elders. God gives us a plan how to help. There is no sense trying to talk to God and to worship to God if we're not on talking terms with a brother. Also, those of us who get offended easily, it's up to us. You see, we often say, well, he sinned against me, so I'm just going to wait for him. Well, that's not how God did things. How many times did Jesus forgive people when he was the one being offended? Now, let's take a case, brother A and brother B. They have a big, brother A offends brother B. If they both biblical and they really want to serve God, they will go to each other and they'll work things out. That's the biblical way to do it. And, half the time, it's been my experience to note that a lot of people think that they're the ones who's been offended. So you can have an argument with somebody and you've been offended and he thinks he's been offended and you both think the other person's the offender. That's why you go to him and you sit down and you talk to him and hash it all out. And you get it straight. One of the things that's going to help, if you refuse to be so thin-skinned, don't have a chip on your shoulder. Love is not easily offended, 1 Corinthians tells us. Little minds are wounded by little things. Men's lives gravitate around some center. If the center is self, you will always be easily offended because someone's going to interfere with your center. But if you focus on God, if your center is God, if your center is on service, when you read about Paul and the life he lived, did he ever write about people offending him? Did he really consider that even an issue? He just didn't let things bother him because he was focused on his God-centered life. If we get lost in the work of the church, we'll have no time for petty offenses. William Gaylord. I'm going to conclude. I don't even know what time it is. But William Gaylord, former mayor of New York, he was denounced and he was shot by some lunatic, and he was almost killed. While laying on the hospital fighting for his life, he said, "Every night I forgive everything and everybody." So the question I want to leave you with tonight, if you die in your sleep in the middle of the night, just wake up to face God, do you want to do it with a hate-filled heart? Or do you want to do it with forgiveness, that you know that you've done everything in your power to forgive those around you?